Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring future creators, and for all those that love really good stories. I'm Ira Pastor. I am your health and aging ambassador along for this journey. The last several shows, we've spent time on what we like to call the different hierarchical levels of health, disease, aging. As we've discussed, the biologic aging disease is a very complex process controlled by nested hierarchies that expand from the very small, our genes, proteins, gene regulatory networks, on up through more complex physiological regulatory networks. And of course, beyond the body to the organism's complex external microenvironment. Today, we're going to spend a little more time in that external microenvironment in an area that's broadly referred to as, we'll say, the holobiome, the area of nature where complex physical interplay exists between individuals of different species. In previous terms that we have discussed on this show, things like interkingdom signaling, semiochemical communication, induced phenotypic plasticity, a lot of complex ways to talk about how living organisms of one species can beneficially affect another in terms of health and wellness in a positive manner. On the previous shows, we primarily spent time in the area of the very small. So we talked about the microbiome and microorganisms, and we also spent time at the level of the hematophagous insects. Today, we're going to go up one level of complexity and talk about the health benefits of the human-animal interaction. Over the last several years, scientists have been looking at a variety of ways in which the physical and mental health benefits are conveyed from species like fish, guinea pigs, dogs, and cats to humans. From a therapeutic perspective, we see news about how interacting with animals can decrease stress-related hormones, lower blood pressure, increase and boost mood, very important biological and psychobiological possibilities, and also interesting things on the diagnostic side, where animals like dogs, for instance, have been shown to be able to sniff out volatile organic compounds and potentially diagnose cancers and diabetes ahead of time. So there's really so much potential here. And today we have a fascinating guest who is really at the epicenter of this, who's going to take us further along the theme into the future. And I'm not referring to Leo. He's here because he's interested in the topic as well. I'm talking about Philip Tedeschi. Philip is a clinical professor and executive director at the Institute for Human-Animal Connection at University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work. He studies and he teaches on the intricate relationship between people, domestic and wild animals in the natural world. And he is globally recognized for his expertise in clinical methods of animal-assisted interventions. And he coordinates his school's animal-assisted social work program and also the Animal and Human Health Global Professional Development Program. He's also the author of a wonderful book called Transforming Trauma, Resilience and Healing Through Our Connections with Animals, New Directions in the Human-Animal Bond. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Philip.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My favorite topic.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. So to start out, could you just basically give the audience a little background on you, sort of where you grew up, how you got interested in this area, how you got interested in social work, and this really quite exciting area of clinical exploration?
Well, yeah, I'd be glad to do that. It's been a windy road in some ways because at least when I started in this particular area, there wasn't such a clear-cut path to study, anthrozoology or human-animal interaction. And, not really even at that time, maybe knowing that what I was so interested in was not just animals or non-human animals alone, or not just human beings, separately, but really the interaction and intersectionality between humans and non-humans. And actually I would add into that maybe other living things as well. So I, went off to college. I grew up in South Chicago and, was pretty much of a city kid, but I had always had a real passion for living things, and animals in particular always intrigued me. I still to this day can't think of anything I enjoy more than watching people and animals interact. And so when I went off to college, I started studying veterinary medicine and studying the kind of necessary core courses in the area of veterinary medicine, I was at the University of Wisconsin and worked in their large animal hospital. In fact, participated as a student veterinary technician. That was my job. And I also taught horseback riding, managed the equine program there. And somewhere along the way, I had a very important interaction with a group of individuals who, at that time, just in that same time frame, we were seeing deinstitutionalization from mental health centers all over the country. And I was asked to teach a class to a group of adults who had been recently deinstitutionalized and were all diagnosed with schizophrenia, and many of whom had had chronic mental illness in their entire lives. And at that time, I knew a lot more really about animals than I did about people. But in that early interaction, just the observation of watching these individuals who, as they came off their bus, were engaged in all kinds of unusual behaviors. I didn't really understand what they were doing, lots of self-stimulation and other institutionalized behaviors. But in the context of almost immediately interacting with other animals, you could see a change, a real transformation. And at the time, we really didn't know how to explain these transformations. We, largely, often, in fact, people would say it's kind of magical, or there's something, special going on, but we don't really know what it is. I recall almost immediately telling my advisor that I wanted to leave vet school and study human-animal connection. And I remember him saying, "You can't do that because there is no such thing." At that time, there really wasn't a format for that. The only person doing work, kind of in that general area were people like Dr. Jane Goodall, who were studying, the complex cognitions and emotions of other animals, and beginning to think more about our own relationship with these animals, and talking about her own special connection with the chimpanzees of Gombe and things like that. So I ended up leaving vet school and writing my own degree program that focused on I would say kind of a consilience of these various academic areas that allowed me to study people and animals together, and I've been doing it ever since.
When I look through your work and I go to your site, one of the core themes that's mentioned has to do with something known as a humane community. And if I may briefly steal a bit from your webpage, you say the overarching conceptual framework for the Institute for Human-Animal Connection research agenda is a humane community, achieving positive and sustained change surrounding many of today's most pressing social issues, calls for increasingly complex understanding of social ecological systems and mechanisms that inform the resilience of a community. And they mention, while concepts such as biophilia, which is defined as the tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life, and the human-animal bond have laid the groundwork for the research agenda, you're working to further advance the understanding of these complex social issues through the humane community framework. And then you talk about a humane community being defined by the presence of leadership, institutions, programs, policies that work collaboratively across this sort of sustainable human-animal environment welfare. Before we get into that, I've one, and this is a philosophical question, or it might sound kind of stupid, but why, in your opinion, we are one of, when you take into account all the microbes and as well, we're one of, around 10 million species on this planet. Why have we as humans sort of separated so badly from what is natural for the last sort of 3.5 billion years? I mean, we destroy our environment, our ocean, the terrestrial biomass, our air. We, not a day goes by that I don't read something about animal abuse by humans. It's sort of like the normal, way for us to exist. Yet it seems like somehow along the way, via evolution, we've forgotten it, or we've diverged from everyone else on this planet. Why is that, in your opinion?
It's such a great question, and also such a big question, and there's probably not a single answer to that, and it's an alarming, you're bringing up a really kind of such an important and really an alarming dimension to the human animals, lack of congruity with every other form of living system. And we study that at our institute. We're very interested in this question about what it would take to offer people the opportunity to rethink that very relationship, and then how do we actually do that? How do we begin that process in an age of mechanization and technology, where we're maybe increasingly more isolated and more connected simultaneously? Those are complicated questions, but I think one of the interesting questions and important ones, is to offer people recognition in this area, as we start to intellectually engage with the question around whether or not we want to be that isolated, and whether or not other living things matter to us, and having relationships with them matter to us. It allows people to engage in some questions about why they want, how we want to design our own families and our own communities and our own existence alongside, these other non-human animals. And there's, I think, many things going on that are very compelling ways for people to start to rethink that very relationship. So one of the, frameworks that we could add to this probably would be, this broad concept sometimes referred to as the scala naturae, or nature's ladder, this order that we would place some animals as valuable in our lives and others as not. And, I know in your program, it sounds like you focus on, the micro life in and around us, which many people don't think about on an everyday level. And they may, largely, fixate on things like their own companion animal as their primary animal. But, that broad question of, why do we put some animals as valuable and others as not, is true for also the way we think about people. So in that nature's ladder, often as a pretty broad, this is a bit broad brush, but largely as, religious doctrine and theory, is that humans are special, designed in the image of God, is kind of the way that many people have ordered their own kind of recognition of the importance of people. And as a result, are not the same as other animals, and special, and as we start to study the interconnectivity between human health and other animal health and environmental health, we realize, in fact, we're not that special. We're part of that system, right? And when we lose sight of that, we're actually not only potentially putting ourselves at risk, but everyone else, and the ecological system health around us. So these are new opportunities to talk about, what kind of relationship we want with other animals. I think another area that's, really emerging, but beginning to offer people, an opportunity to rethink this, is the issue of sentience. And,
Sure.
Whether other animals are participants on the planet, or are they just here for us to be, manipulated and exploited or used, or is there other ways to have relationships with animals? I mean, I think the friend you have on your shoulder is an example of that, right? We often feel better in the context, and this is really at the heart of the concept of humane communities. We actually feel better, function better, are healthier and more resilient when we're in the presence of other healthy living things, or beings, I should say. And these systems, are informing us all the time about our own well-being. And so I would say, the exciting thing is there's new ways to re-examine these relationships, and new science that supports the importance of it. The fact that we've been so callous and largely, think of ourselves as maybe the only, kind of the only thing happening, I think the time has come to change that.
I agree with you on that wholeheartedly. So, in the your institute's sort of breadth, or the different pillars that you're involved in, I look at the site and I see influences of the human-animal interaction on physical health, mental health, and then a section on, I guess, general social work, sort of occupational matters. So there's a issue or a program I think you're involved with, sort of prisoners. Could you? I would love to just give you the floor, so because you're the expert. But could you go into each of these and just sort of give the audience sort of the top line on what you're most excited about in each of these categories, what some of the short-term wins are that you see? I think maybe you have a program in autism that I read about as well. I'll give you the floor to talk as much as you want about these, but love to hear about them all, or as much as you'd like to.
Sure. Well, sure. Yeah, I'm glad to do that. Well, maybe the best way to, kind of offer listeners kind of a sense of what we're up to is we focus primarily in three core areas at our institute. And I should say, we're housed at the Graduate School of Social Work on the campus of the University of Denver. So most of our work, and I'm a professional social worker by training, and many of our students are, although there are students now coming from many other disciplines, including education, psychology, law, business even, where these issues are informing their work as well. But that's our home base, and it's an important context, because one of the really kind of, I think, opportunities for our program has been that we aren't located just in an animal science or a veterinary medicine perspective, but we're really looking at these issues through the lens of the social sciences, and really at the question of how do people influence these questions, and how do people relate to these questions. So our core areas, our first one that you've mentioned a few of, is the health promoting benefits of animals, or sometimes we call animal assisted therapies, or more commonly they're referred to as animal assisted interventions. And what's happening in this field is now across the entire human lifespan, really from even prenatal or early childhood developmental considerations all the way to the end of life, animals play a significant role in people's health and well-being. And, that's really what we teach. So I'd say a big part of our academic programs are persons who are interested in incorporating animals into special populations, into influencing the therapeutic environments that they're working in by incorporating animals. And then the bigger question is not only kind of how you do that, kind of the protocols for it, but how do we do it safely and ethically, so that it's also equally or mutually beneficial to the animals that are involved, as well as the human health agenda involved. So an example, a really nice example, is the one you gave, which is the canine prison programs. And we've been doing a lot of work in that area. We now have, for example, prison canine programs in every state in the United States. And these are programs that are an interesting example of kind of these integrated or almost one health strategies, where when we're utilizing dogs that, let's say, are at risk, or animals that are at risk of not being valued, potentially being in shelters or being euthanized, who are now brought to these prison settings, are raised, nurtured, properly cared for, even trained and socialized for adoption in a prison setting. Those often offer these awesome rehabilitative benefits for the inmates themselves. And the changes that are occurring on the human side of that are quite remarkable, really, where you see persons who, are, first of all, doing this very difficult period of time where they're isolated from society, but now are able to engage in this highly intimate, important relationship of caring for another animal. And that begins to change them. And we see positive peer culture dimensions flourish, different interactions between inmates and correctional officers. We start to see empathy that wasn't there before, the capacity for skill development and social benefits, and learning how to make friends and keep friends. And then, really almost functioning outside of the prison walls, even while they're inside the walls, by having worked with an animal who then gets adopted by a community member, and that animal leaves and becomes part of the outside community. And so we've done this now, this work, for quite some time. In fact, we just had the remarkable opportunity to open the very first prison dog program in the Middle East, in Israel, northern Israel. And that has been an interesting project, in part because we were testing whether these ideas have cultural accuracy, have the capacity to be accurate maybe in other cultures. And in this particular case, it looks like it's going well. We've just been doing it for about a year. So anyways, this first area is really the role that animals can play in all different kinds of human health dimensions. And we see animals involved in things like important child development considerations. We know that animals are some of the first reciprocal playmates in people's homes. You know, just the prevalence alone of animals in the households across North America, about 2/3 of all homes with children have animals in them. And the ways in which those children encounter and meet and learn to live with those animals are defining features of their child development, you know, are building blocks literally to successful functioning later on. So we should be thinking about pet keeping not just as a recreational hobby, but probably one of the most important strategies we have for parenting, you know, things like that. In adolescence, or at-risk youth, or other populations that are at risk, animals can play a very important role as a trusting relationship. We're now seeing animals incorporated into numerous forms of intervention for trauma. And, you know, the book that you mentioned that I have coming out, the reason we actually wrote that particular and created this compendium of focus in this area was that there are many people who just don't trust other people. And, you know, when somebody's trust has been damaged in other human beings, one of the real challenges as a clinician is how do you help somebody who won't trust you or can't talk to you or no longer believes that other people are worth having relationships with. Most individuals, you know, including all of our service members coming back from combat, for example, it's not that they don't want relationships, but they have been trained. Their brain has been trained, and their lives have often been shaped by these traumatic experiences that inform them that people are not always good news, you know. And so animals can really serve as an important first step or beachhead in rebuilding confidence and trust in relationships. And what we now know is that, you know, relationship and social support don't have to be human beings, as you know, and that's an important health dimension right off the bat, because isolation and loneliness is the single most dangerous mental health condition that we treat in the United States. You know, that has an indicator of lethality that's something close to the equivalent of being about, you know, something like a chronic cigarette smoker, right? And is being chronically lonely. And so these are very important relationships that are undergird really the opportunities that people have for improving all different dimensions of their health, looking at just the interpersonal neurobiological changes of somebody who has an animal sitting on their shoulder, you know, or sitting at their feet or right next to them, or you know, have routine contact with a safe animal, is amazing, because it actually offers almost the identical you know, picture, neurobiological picture, to that of a human interaction with a safe individual, or a mother-child interaction, those sorts of things. So those build the building blocks for recovery. So when we think about overcoming addiction or trauma or other forms of depression and anxiety, you know, and even a really good example of this that we're very interested in at our university is the area of emotional support animals. That, you know, that area gets routinely kind of hammered as maybe a fraudulent area where people are misusing animals, you know, and trying to get by. You know, but, you know, and, you know, of course there are these one-off stories of the person, you know, who might try to bring a peacock on an airplane. That's not the real story, right? The real story is, do people actually function better in the presence of other healthy animals? and other healthy living systems. Do animals actually help us function better? And the answer is yes, they do. And the science is beginning to show that. And we shouldn't really be that surprised, right? This is the same systems that inform all natural systems. Would be healthy connection with other living systems informs our own well-being. And so that's at the basis of the kind of therapeutic side of this. I guess I should add, all the way to the other end of the lifespan. So many people are now choosing to go into things like the last days and hours of their life, even hospice,
Mm-hmm.
a companion animal with them on, as they die,
Right.
because they are actually feel better and safer and more loved at that time in their life. So these are fantastic strategies that have tremendous intersectional benefits in integrated health. I think we'll start to see more research, although we are starting to see quite a lot now, including NIH is now funding and doing major work in these areas, and many other universities are as well. So the other areas that our institute is very interested in is animals and communities.
Okay.
So we're looking at these connections between, what are the what's the social capital that allow communities to function well, and risk factors that cause it to not function well. So when we start to look at dimensions of humane communities, what we're really looking at are what are those building blocks that allow for communities to be offered opportunities for these kinds of supportive protective variables. So protecting green spaces, pocket parks, healthy ecological systems, just even what we look at out our window have implications for everything from child academic outcomes to our mental health, our overall and generalized mental health. And then, conversely, cruelty is not without consequence. And so when we're looking at systems that are being damaged or harmed or chronically exposed to various forms of callousness or cruelty, those also are risk factors that impact not just child developmental health,
Mm-hmm.
literally shaping the type of child that grows up in a community, but they also shape the human developmental, adult human developmental process as well. So we believe that these are, in fact, critical dimensions of investment, places for investment, and protection, and necessary dialogue and discussion around what kinds of communities and world do we want to live in. Here in Colorado, we have the notorious reputation for being the vector point of these school shootings with the Columbine high school shooting.
Yeah.
On the internet, you can download the Columbine RPG Massacre video game where the serial, killer in that case keeps a score for you as you walk through the virtual hallways of Columbine High School shooting fellow students. That's now available for other, the Virginia Tech version and the, other, I'm sure we'll see, and all the bad taste that is, other forms of that. These are these first person shooter types of games. These are, typical content that's going into the developmental experience of children. Ironically, the part of the brain that's most excited by those games is the same part of the brain that's stimulated by humane education and interaction with real animals. And, so these become measures of what kinds of communities we're going to live in. I think the context of a humane community is a broader, more robust discussion on humane education in general. It's not just for children anymore, right? It's not just for the person going to their local shelter who needs to learn to care for an animal. It's really our broader question of how do we care for the world around us and the living beings in our particular world. And so that's, I would say, our second area. We also are the only university in the country that has an animal cruelty forensic clinic where we provide the Colorado courts with specialized forensic evaluations, help them make sense of cruelty. And are teaching psychologists and evaluators how to make sense of cruelty. It's not really that exotic, and there's things we can do about it. We can help people become, more kind and more compassionate to others. So I think, the concept somehow that somebody is born mean and is always going to be cruel, or that, isn't true. It's possible for people to be exposed to experiences that shape how they want to participate. And many people who have grown up in cruel environments or have normalized violence will continue to engage in callous behavior. But that's not the only way to go, right? So I think we can bring these into universities and create a really vital dialogue in that area. So we see higher education and universities playing a major role in this. We even are talking about the concept of humane universities. How do universities shape every aspect of their agenda to really be much more engaged in these aspects of public good and in general, the role that they might play in their own communities and the broader discourse in this area. And then I should say in that area, one of our major programs that we're very excited about is a program called Pets for Life that looks at the fact that we have animals in almost every community, including many underserved communities. Mm-hmm. And when we study the connection, the intersection between human health and animal health, what we find is that we can influence both simultaneously by providing good services to animals or to people. We influence the metrics on the other side, right? And so if, many people have heard concepts like food deserts, for example, but we also have things like veterinary deserts, or places where it's difficult for persons who have animals in their life to access supportive services for the health and well-being of animals. When we provide good resources to people in communities, they use them. And they use them to support their own child's health, their own health, their animal's health. And in general, when we start to see a family with those kinds of resources available to them, we start to see that impact their neighborhoods and their communities, their interaction with others, and those sorts of things. So these become, very exciting conversations about, we need good fire departments. We also need good and well-resourced animal welfare and sheltering operations that have, the capacity to reach into underserved communities as well, things like that. So then I think the third area is one that we sometimes refer to as conservation social work, or One Health. And this is really the intersection between people, animals, and the environment. And we are studying these dimensions. We have programs actually that we participate in internationally and all over the world. So a student in our program may choose to work as a humane educator in, at the giant panda base in Chengdu, China, and is studying the intersection between things like habitat protection, animal welfare in the form of endangered species, and inviting, communities surrounding those settings to participate in things like biodiversity protection, and looking at the intersection of those areas. I've been teaching a course in East Africa for the last about decade, where we look at the connection between deep poverty and degradation of environments, animal welfare issues like bushmeat trade or poaching, for example, and these connections. So these are international examples of One Health. But we have them right here in Colorado, in fact, where we see animals like the prairie dog that's targeted, by communities, often bulldoze, the entire colonies bulldozed. When we see a housing development go in, little do people realize is that when we bulldoze those colonies, we're undermining the very ecological system that support everything from, black-footed ferrets to the eagles that people enjoy flying overhead. And so if we want to live alongside healthy ecological systems, guess what? We need to be interested in prairie dogs and their survival as well. So rewilding and the coexistence, the protection of spaces that are not just human spaces, become an important dialogue in what kinds of lives we want to live overall, and need to be interested in the health of all of those ecosystems. So, that's a thumbnail of kind of our core areas. And we are working in a lot of very exciting aspects of this. And what's been amazing is the graduate students who come to our program are just the smartest. I mean, I'm sure there's smart students in almost every university, but these are students who clearly have been thinking about this intersection long before they get to us. And, lots of young people, I think, want a different dialogue, want a different relationship with the living world than our modern society, talks about overtly.
I think anyone that gets involved with this type of work clearly is, we refer to as the systems thinker. I came up in the pharmaceutical industry, and we do very little systems thinking in this business. But really, the ability to think in such broad strokes across these complex systems, ecosystems, biospheres, and so forth, it sounds like it takes a really unique mind to come up with those ideas and really immerse themselves in this. And as I'm sitting here, I live in downtown Philadelphia in sort of an urban jungle, and a lot of the things you were saying resonated when you look across the swath of issues we have in terms of the children. And a couple months ago I went down to Longwood Gardens, south of southern Pennsylvania, and picked up a book on this nature deprivation syndrome. That just, these kids are missing this major piece. And it's not just the trees. It's the birds, it's the squirrels. It's a lot of the things that I took for granted growing up. We had that in the city back then. But so, from the very young to the other thing, you rattled my mind is sort of this concept you hear about of these blue zones, where people are living extremely long, in places like Greece and Costa Rica and so forth. And they usually talk about, well, there's the family thing, but there's also, they're eating a lot of vegetables and drinking a lot of red wine. But no, I think, like you're pointing out, it's probably much more than that. And this whole, the whole topic the integrated humane community concept, it probably affects that as well. So, both ends of life. And it's just, I find it completely fascinating.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And one of the things you bring up, just the nature of healthy animals, and when we interact with other animals that are healthy, one of the things we naturally do is we move, we play, we start to interact with those animals. If you watch an animal that's thriving, it's a joyful experience, and then we take part in that, often by being equally joyful and likely, in all likelihood, engaging in some of the very same kinds of things that we would identify as important health activities, like walking or moving, or those sorts of things. Those are hard to do when you have no place to play.
Right.
Stuff like that. So these are highly connected and opportunities. And I think the good news is that, when you talk about these in ways that make sense to people and communities, there's very little resistance, really, right? I mean, it's kind of, to a large degree, there's a lot of common ground here that, even if we're building just off of humans' desire to have a better life themselves, it turns out that we can build common ground because by, having good animal welfare standards, for example, we improve our own lives. By having healthy ecological systems, healthy water systems, good air, good quality, marine ecosystems, we also improve our own lives. So these are areas we should be able to build momentum and common ground.
That's wonderful to hear. Before we wrap up, we typically on the show, we shift from the science into sort of the science fiction for a moment. I'm going to allow you, Philip Tedeschi, to take a journey in the time machine that I built in the other room. And you can travel anywhere in time you want. So you can go to the past, you can go to the future, you can speak to whoever you want. Who's the one person that you would love to meet and have a conversation with? And what do you want to talk to them about? You can take your time and think of that one.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Well, um, oh, that's a great one. Well, I suppose I would be interested in being in communication with some of there's many deep thinkers in the areas that I'm interested in,
Hmm.
and one of the persons that I think is a really interesting person to read, kind of almost between the lines, is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, on one level, began to document kind of the individual ecosystems and species that he encountered. But one of the things that he started doing, it's often, it's actually, these were the least popular of his writings at the time, but he started talking about these areas of animal kind of unique personalities, almost characterological. You would probably now talk about them as cognition and emotion. What he was starting to see in terms of personality, and um, I would love to have talked to him about whether that was his intent. Like, did he see that as a scientific question, the
Hmm.
like the importance of documenting that, or was that more kind of casual or careless? Because if we knew that, and he was able to have shaped our our relationship with other animals as early as he was beginning to document this, we might think differently about things like keeping animals in captivity, or we
Hmm.
might think differently about factory farming, for example,
Right.
and or even the consumption of animals as in the way we're doing it now across the world. These are tremendously dangerous ways in which we're undermining not only our own health, but really, many people would argue one of the most, you know, profound forms of social injustice towards other non-human animals. And so, he's not the only person. There's many theorists and ethicists that have shaped, kind of our core areas, including our probably big religious, theories as well. But I long for a future where we would challenge ourselves to do better, and rethink those relationships. I think it's the necessity for our own, basic health and the health of the planet, but it's also morally, problematic, and hard for me to believe that our world can become a safer and better place if we aren't prepared to confront the scope of cruelty and callousness that we have directed towards other non-human animals.
I long for that future too.
Yeah.
With you 100%. Uh, Once again, it's been Philip Tedeschi, clinical professor, executive director of the Institute for Human-Animal Connection, University of Denver. Um, Look for his book, Transforming Trauma, Resilience and Healing Throughout the Connections with Animals, New Directions in the Human-Animal Bond. Philip, thank you again so much for coming on. Love hearing your thoughts and ideas, and really appreciate you spending your time with us and bringing these ideas to everybody else, because these are ideas that people need to learn about. And thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, and anybody who's interested in learning more, please feel free to have them reach out.
Well, we'll link to your sites and everything else that you do when the show goes live.
Great.
Thanks
Thanks
again.
so much.